concerns and the struggles of the Asian American communities. So today, I thank the Chinese American Friendship Association for organizing this session. So today's session's topic is going to be focused on Asian American community safety. As we know that the safety issues has been a big concern among the Asian American communities. In the town of Chapel Hill, Asian Americans account for about 13% of our town's population. In the past decade, Asian American populations has grown 36%. It's almost double the growth rate of the general population in the town of Chapel Hill. So for our community, many of us coming to the town of Chapel Hill with great aspiration and bring their hard work, trying to bring a better life for themselves, better opportunities for their children. But I think that in the past year, and I think that many of us have experienced the safety issues that in our community. And just like many other communities around the country, there is this discrimination and violence against the Asian American communities. And with the increase of the crime incidences around in many parts of the country, so there is the Asian American communities are definitely on the edge. They're worrying about their safeties for themselves and for their family. So I think that tonight we are very fortunate to have the chief of the police chief of the town of Chapel Hill, Chris Blue, to join us in this very important conversation. Chief Blue has been serving in the Chapel Hill town for more than 25 years in the police department, and he has been in this position as the police chief for more than 12 years. So he's definitely an expert with tremendous knowledge in this area, and we're very, very grateful that for you to taking the time to join us today. And I'm really glad that to have Alan Vuansi to join us today as well. Alan is my council colleague in the past 4 years that we are serving in the Chapel Hill Town Council together. And last year, Alan is served as the liaison to the Chapel Hill Community Safety Task Force. So he is very well versed in this area. And Alan is also someone who's very passionate to bring different voices and the peoples from different communities together to solve the issues, to find the common solutions for our community. So I'm very thankful for both of you. So Chief Blue and Mr. Buanti, do you have a few words for the audience?
Go ahead, sir. Sorry, I'll be brief. Don't want to disrupt the flow, but first of all, thank you, my fellow former council colleague Harbin Gu, for inviting me to join you all today. It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure serving with Councilmember Gu. It was also a pleasure to work with Chief Blue in terms of thinking about community safety in Chapel Hill, thinking about ways that we can improve it. I've always appreciated Chief Blue for his openness, his willingness to think outside the box, and all in an effort to make sure that everyone is safe in Chapel Hill. I'll just say a quick word about the kind of latest endeavor that I'm in right now. I'm running for State House to represent Chapel Hill and Carborough, and one of the main motivations for running is for an affordable, accessible, and inclusive community. Safety features prominently in that, and making sure that we empower folks with the tools they need to feel safe, to feel included, to feel welcome. That is among my chief priorities, and so I'm looking forward to listening to the discussion that ensues. I'm looking forward to being an advocate for everyone here on this call and those who will listen afterward, because as Hongbin said, I'm deeply invested in making sure that everyone, especially our Asian American community, feels safe and feels welcome here. And maybe at a later point, I can talk a bit about some of the specific things that I have in mind that would serve that end, especially around hate crimes legislation that North Carolina badly needs to adopt. That would also help out law enforcement, but I look forward to engaging with folks on the issues here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. So now, without much ado, then I will just hand the time over to Chief Blue, and he's going to give us an overview of the safety operations in the town of Chapel Hill, and especially in the area of what the town and the community can work together to ensure that everyone in our town is safe, including the Asian American communities. So thank you so much. The time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's great to be with everyone tonight. I think the last time we got together for this conversation was about this time a year or so ago. So it's good to reconnect, and I really appreciate you all coming together. I've got a few slides that I'm going to go through fairly quickly because I know you all have some questions that you want to be sure we hit. And I'll try to hit those at least a little bit when I flip through my slides in a minute. But I look forward to our Q&A afterwards, and anything that I miss or anything that you want me to say more about, please just bring that up when we get to our Q&A. I do want to quickly say I appreciate Mr. Moinsey's kind words about our department and how we do our work. And I do think we have a special police department in Chapel Hill. In fact, I won't say I think, I know. Because I interact with police departments and police leaders from all across the state. And we do have something exceptional and unique here. But that is because of all of you on this call and all of the other people in our community who ask us to think differently about our work and to think about our work in ways that maybe is not traditional or ways of law enforcement to approach community problems. So I do think we have something unique in Chapel Hill, and it's because we are Chapel Hill. And I'm always glad to brag about it, but I don't want to take credit for it. I want us all to take credit for it. If I am able to share, again, I'm going to go through the slides quickly just because I went to the trouble to assemble them, so I feel an obligation to go through them. But I think our Q&A will probably be the best part of our conversation. So indulge me for just a minute. And I think generally the slides I have are responsive to the things you all are interested in hearing, but I encourage you to ask questions. I'll go through them quickly. Can everybody see that okay? Great. Okay, very good. All right. So what I'm going to cover real quickly is just an overview of our department, very high level, very fast. A little bit about when to call 911, an overview of, crime in our community, and particularly as it compares to surrounding communities. And then I'll try to, hit some of the areas that I know you all are interested in hearing about, and then we'll just move to some Q&A. And so this is just very quickly an organizational chart for what we really call our community safety grouping in the town of Chapel Hill. And so the way we're currently organized is the police department and our building services departments work together kind of under the same umbrella. So you'll see on the left side of the left 2/3 of this org chart, you'll see police operations, and on the right, you'll see our building and development services. And the thinking behind that, a number of years ago, our previous manager really thought that all safety related kinds of town functions should work together as closely as possible. And so he arranged our organizational chart across the town in such a way that public safety folks and other departments with a real focus on safety, like our building inspectors and our code enforcement people, our emergency management folks, our fire folks, work very closely together. And that's really represented in this organizational chart here. So it's a little non-traditional, but again, that's how we are at Chapel Hill. We spend a lot of time in our department on community engagement. Our officers, particularly when it's not a pandemic or an immediate post-pandemic time, are doing literally dozens of community outreach events with all kinds of community groups every week. And that's typically where we learn the most about what our community wants and needs from us, is actually getting out and talking to the people we serve. So I'll just put a quick plug in here. Any group with which you are associated, the one that's assembled tonight, a civic club, a neighborhood group, a group in your workplace, neighborhood association, whatever it may be, within the Chapel Hill city limits where you might have space for us on an agenda to come talk and maybe more importantly, listen and answer questions, we are always going to come. And all you need to do is send me an email, cblue@townofchapelhill.org, and that'll show up on a slide in a few minutes in case you missed it. And I'll get somebody there. Again, because I talked earlier about how our work is informed by hearing from our community, we have got to continually hear from our community and do our work. I'll say more when we get to our Reimagining Community Safety Task Force work, but something of which we're very proud and that is very unique in our community is our crisis unit. And I talked a little bit with you all last year about this, but just by way of review, we have in our department a division of full-time master's level social workers, not police officers, who go out in our community and provide service when law enforcement may not be the right answer, or sometimes to complement law enforcement, depending on the nature of the call for service. These are master's level clinicians, social with on the ground social work experience, who go out and help us respond to mental health crises, to folks who are suffering from substance abuse issues. Of course, as you would imagine, they respond to folks who have experienced trauma of all types. And thankfully, in our community, we don't have a lot of violent crime, but when we do, obviously, it's traumatic for folks and life-changing. And to be able to have this resource to go out with our officers, or sometimes instead of our officers, is truly unique. The last few years, you're increasingly hearing in communities across our country about this idea of social workers complementing police officers, or again, responding instead of police officers. It's a wonderful idea. In our community, we started it back in 1973. So we have almost a 50-year history of this kind of capability, and we continue to grow that and invest significantly. It's always important when we have a group of folks together to talk about when to call 911. And I want to say a few things about this because I think it's really important. For years, I've done community outreach work on behalf of our department, and I've said to folks, you know your community better than we do. If you see something that concerns you, makes you feel uncomfortable, seems out of place, call us. And we'll respond and we'll find out what's going on and we'll take care of the problem. And I don't want to abandon that message. But what I do want to say is that what we've observed anecdotally for a number of years and what we're now putting a little bit of analysis behind is the reality that oftentimes people call 911 when they see somebody in their neighborhood who looks different from them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that person is doing anything wrong, other than maybe they look like they don't live there or shouldn't be there. Well, I'll tell you, we're taking a real hard look at the kinds of calls to which we respond when there's nothing more implicating than the fact that someone with a different color of skin is in a neighborhood of people of predominantly another color. And so I wanted to pause on this one for just a minute because I've been guilty over the years of just saying to our community, call 911, we'll show up and solve the problem. And while in my heart, I believe that's true, I think increasingly for communities to be welcoming and inclusive for everyone, as Mr. Boyncey said in his opening comments, we really have to challenge this notion of calling the authorities when something in our neighborhood, when someone in our neighborhood looks different from us. And maybe in our Q&A, we'll get to say more about that. All of that said, and I think that's very important, I don't mean to put it aside, but I will say this, if you need us, call us. I have great confidence in our ability to respond, but I think our community ought to really think long and hard, and we're prepared to help lead this conversation about what calling 911 can really lead to. And I think that's probably a bigger conversation than we have time for tonight, but it's one I think needs to really consider. This is just a quick overview of 2021 crime rates compared to our other triangle communities. You will see here that in our community, we are fortunate that we have very little violent crime. Certainly when compared to our appears in the triangle. What we do have, and this has been the case for as long as I've been an officer in Chapel Hill, is a fairly high amount of property-related crime. This is an affluent community. Oftentimes, victims of crime happen to be either students or people in historically underrepresented communities. And so these data bear that out. We've had an increase in property crime the last few years, like many communities have experienced. What I will say is that we've not had any hate crimes reported at all, including against anybody in the Asian American community in 2021. That's reported to us. However, we of course know nationally that data says that reports of hate crimes against the Asian American community risen 342% between 2020 and 21. In 1 year's time, 342% increase. The year prior, 124% increase. And the FBI is telling us that hate crime nationally across all demographics is at its highest reported levels in 2020, which is their last full year of data since 2008. So higher in 2020 than it was in any 12 years prior. What we know is this kind of crime is underreported, if reported at all. So I don't mean to suggest we're immune from these events in our community by any stretch. I will just say that we haven't had direct reports. We certainly know that people in our community, Asian American folks in our community, hear comments, feel threatened, feel concerned, a general sense of unease, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. We know that, and we know nationally that reported hate crime rates are undoubtedly underreported. So I don't mean to hang my hat on these data in any way whatsoever. I'm just sharing with you what's reported to us. I do think it's important to note that in our community, as I mentioned before, we're not experiencing the significant spike in violent crime that many communities are. We are seeing some slight upticks. It's worth noting our violent crime rate in 2021 was higher than 2019. Robbery jumped in 2020. Robbery jumped from 31 reported incidents to 48. Aggravated assaults were up by about 25%. This was true in Raleigh and Durham too, on a larger scale. But we are seeing some of what communities are reporting nationally ticking up in terms of violent crime. Thankfully, our numbers remain very low. Mr. Boyncey mentioned earlier, and I think this is worth pausing on for just a minute. In North Carolina, we don't have a good hate crime statute. In the last legislative session, some of our elected officials, including some in our area, were leading an effort to get a more robust hate crime statute passed in North Carolina. I don't believe that ever got out of committee. It certainly did not make the crossover, which means it won't be taken up in the short session coming up this summer. And we desperately need it. What we do have in the bar to meet for a federal hate crime is very, very high. And quite honestly, it's hard to meet it from an investigative point of view. And in North Carolina, instead, we have a charge called ethnic intimidation. You see there on the slide that it too is fairly tough to investigate, but perhaps more importantly, it's really just a misdemeanor offense. It's not a very serious offense. We need stronger legislation in North Carolina. I mean, Mr. Boyncey agrees with that. When he gets his turn in Raleigh, I have confidence that he will shake something loose for us, and he can know that he has my support. Some areas that you all identified as just important for you to receive updates. Let me quickly talk about our Reimagining Community Safety Task Force. Back in 2020, on the heels of the murder of George Floyd, understandably, folks in our community were looking for reassurance and action to feel confident that our community wouldn't suffer the same kind of fate that Mr. Floyd suffered at the hands of Minneapolis Police Department. And our council heard from our community that we really need to take a look at what safety means in our community for everybody. And so they impaneled a task force. Now, as Hong Ben mentioned at the beginning, I've been around a long time, worked for the town a long time, been in a leadership role for a long time, and I've seen a lot of task forces come and go, and I mean due respect to all of them. But I will tell you, the one that council impaneled a couple of years ago around community safety is one of, if not the best I've ever seen. Really engaged, representative, hardworking group of folks who were ready, who came to work. And work they did, they started meeting in fall of 2020, and they met 25, 30 times, something like that, over the course of 8 or 9 months, during which they discussed, debated, and ultimately recommended a number of ways to ensure our community is as safe as it can be for everyone, and that the services provided in our community are really responsive to those kinds of indicators that upstream, if addressed, can keep people out of the criminal justice system. And again, you heard from Mr. Boyncey in his comments, that's not all about avoiding encounters with the police, but what we also know is encounters with the police oftentimes are an offshoot of, mental health crisis, substance abuse crisis, poverty, homelessness, challenges in finding employment, and so on. And the task force took a really holistic view at what overall community health looks like, therefore what community safety will look like. Some of the specific recommendations around policing, and there were many, and I encourage you to go on the town website. There's a whole web page dedicated to the Reimagining Community Safety Task Force. You can find a report on there, you can find minutes from their meetings and so on. And you'll see, as I said, how hard they work. I wanted to just hit a few highlights around police department specific recommendations. And this is in no way all of the things that they talked about, but things that have had some recent action I want to share with you. Some of you may have followed our quarterly report that the police department's put out for, 10 years now. That tracks all kinds of things about our activities, demographics of folks we stop on traffic stops and our enforcement decisions, kinds of training our officers get, kinds of complaints we get, and what the outcomes are on those complaints. A whole host of metrics that are intended to do a few things. Number one, share with our community how we examine ourselves and what our analysis of our own data, what we think that means and what that tells us and how it informs our community response. But also, if you take a look at our report and compare it to other reports from other police departments around the country, I will just tell you, you won't find anything like it anyplace else. The most recent report that I published was 25 or 26 pages long with very, very granular data about all kinds of important things that our department does. And why it's relevant to the task force is that the task force said to us, we like what you're doing, we want you to do more of it. So the report used to be published on a quarterly basis. We are now doing it on a semi-annual basis. The task force thinking there was over a 6-month period of time, trends become more apparent, the data is actually more meaningful in a longer chunk of time. We prefer to see it in 6-month increments. As a result of that recommendation about enhanced use of data, we've also bought some software that helps us present the material in a way that's a little more user-friendly to the reader. Again, that also is available on the police department website. If you go to the town website, to the police page, and then public information, you'll find that, and you'll find all of the copies from a number of years now. A lot of good information in there. Task force also, the recommendations also spoke to continued review of the school resource officer program in the Chapel Hill Carborough school system. As many of you probably know, our school resource officer program has been studied and continues to be studied by our school board for the last couple of years as to what the appropriate model is to have in our schools with respect to school resource officer program, if any at all. School board actually will vote on whether the program remains in the schools or not. There, sometime in early June, So the task force recommended that we remain engaged in that process and that study, and we have done so. And encourage you to go to the school board website and kind of follow where that conversation has gone. I'm certainly glad to try to answer questions you have. Task force also made recommendations about continued community investment in mental health and substance abuse response. And of course, much of that is bigger than what the police department can do. But what we also know, I mentioned my crisis unit before, what we know is our crisis unit is a really important step to responding to folks who are experiencing mental health and substance abuse crises without having to send the cops out there. And with that in mind, we requested in last year's budget, and our council gave to us an additional social work position. So we continue to build out that function. And again, I think allows us to respond in a way that's complementary to the officers, or in some cases instead of the officers, which is consistent with another recommendation that came out of the task force, which is to try to think about ways to provide community safety that doesn't include sending an armed police officer. There are times we know an armed cop is the right thing, but we also know that many times that's not necessary. In fact, most calls to 911 in our community don't require an armed police officer at all. And so we are thinking about ways to shrink that footprint where it makes sense to do that. And one additional noteworthy way to do that is the beginning of our virtual response unit, where we are doing, we have officers dedicated to taking, and not just officers, actually employees dedicated to taking police reports over the phone where they can. And soon, maybe by the end of the summer, we will roll out an online reporting option for folks, which again, for low-level kinds of things, where an officer doesn't have to physically respond out into the field, it allows us to take your police report, initiate at least a preliminary investigation without having to send an officer out, which in many cases, that is the right thing to do. The last thing I'll say about the task force, and then certainly we'll answer questions at the end if you have them, is one of the recommendations was for the town to continue to support the street outreach and harm reduction unit that the county stood up about a year and a half ago. These are folks who, oftentimes folks who have had their own lived experience, who work very closely and intensely with people who are suffering from homelessness, many of whom also are often suffering from substance abuse issues. Again, a county function, but the recommendation was that our town provides some subsidy to that function, which our council did. They provided some additional funding within this fiscal year to that program, which has allowed them to add some additional staff. And I mentioned in the title, street outreach, harm reduction, that says it all. What it also means is when they can be dispatched, instead of a police officer going, again, I think that makes task force interest. So I encourage you to also go on the town website, look for Reimagining Community Safety Task Force, and read the report. It is a remarkable work. I think it will inform the way our town looks at the holistic provision of community safety for years to come. And again, I'll take some questions about that. I'm almost at the end of my slides. I want to tell you just a little bit about our departmental makeup. It is not diverse enough. Sadly, over the last 5 to 7 years, we are seeing law enforcement applicants dropping like a stone nationally. That remains true in North Carolina and in Chapel Hill too. In fact, we have some unique challenges in terms of hiring in Chapel Hill, and that most folks who we hire can't afford to live here, because they're driving here from someplace else. And increasingly, we're finding surrounding agencies who are matching, or in some cases exceeding our salaries, which makes it really difficult to recruit and retain. So our demographic breakdown is not what it needs to be. Although there is hope. We're running an academy right now of officers, and it's one of our most diverse classes we've had in years. And we're hiring for a group in the fall for another police academy. We have initiated a partnership with Meredith College and North Carolina Central University, hoping that we can see a little more variety in what our applicants and what our workforce looks like. Right now, we have 89 sworn officers total. That's out of an authorized strength of 102. So 13 vacancies right now. That's counting those rookies who we have in the police academy right now. 77 of those officers are white. 10 of those are African American, 2 are Asian American. we hope to see those numbers balance out soon. Unfortunately, nationally and at the state level, the applicant pools are not very diverse, but we're hoping some of our strategic and focused recruiting will help us with that. Just a couple more quick things. We are seeing a dramatic spike in mental health related calls. Involuntary commitments have increased by several 100%, and that's happening nationally. And of course, in our community, we're not immune from that. And that is likely attributed to the pandemic and all the associated challenges that people are experiencing. We're fortunate, of course, that we've got a fantastic hospital facility right here where we can get people help immediately if they need it, but we really are lacking more holistic street level mental health resources. The emergency room is generally not the best first option. And sadly, that is oftentimes what we have. I think one of your questions was around safety during vacation time when people are traveling. Here at the bottom, if you go to our town website and put in permits and services with the police department, you will find our house check program. You can fill out a form online that tells us when you're going to be gone and for how long. We will actually check on the property for you while you are traveling. We're glad to do that. Of course, that's free of charge. And the nice thing about that is not only are we getting some regular checks on it, but if we were to discover anything, you will have left your contact information and we can get that information to you more quickly, as opposed to you coming home from your vacation and finding a problem. There's my email address at the bottom, cblue@townofchapelhill.org. You'll also see just a more general mailbox there, policeinfo@townofchapelhill.org. Reach out anytime in this day and age, as is the case for all of you. I'm sure I'm on email about 20 hours a day, so I'm pretty responsive if you reach out, and welcome out to come join me another time. So I'm going to close that out and see what other questions you have for me. Okay. So thanks for indulging me. I just wanted to get those things out and give you a chance to react to them, and I'll take whatever questions you have. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. That is a lot of material to wrap our heads around. But I think that it's good that we are going to have this channel open. So in the future, we will have people to bring their questions forward and feel more comfortable to get in touch with our town's police when they need help. You mentioned, so I think that let's address some of the clarification questions first before we move on to the questions that I see people are posting their questions in the chat room, which is great. So if you have additional questions that you would like to ask during this session, you can write in the chat room, or if you will want to make a comments, please also mention that in the chat room so we can call on you to open your mic, so bring you to the front. Okay, so Chief Blue, you mentioned that there is 2 Asian Americans in the current police task force. Can you comment on their language capability? Are they able to communicate with the residents who are not able to speak English? Can you just comment on?
Yeah, and of course, that's a really great question. I can't tell you what their language capability is, but I know they both are bilingual. And thank you for mentioning that. We do incentivize employees who speak more than one language, and that does help us recruit and retain people. And so we have, and I wish I had thought to bring a survey of what all the different language capabilities we have in-house among our employees. That's a great question. I'll try to get you an answer to that, actually. And Hong Ben would ask you to share that with everyone. What I will say is we represent a wide array of actually very proficient speakers. In the event that we encounter a language that we don't have a speaker on duty to respond to, we also maintain a contract with a third-party translation service that has literally hundreds of language capability offerings that our officers know how to access in real time. So I think we're well equipped there, but of course, it's most helpful when you have an officer who's language and who can engage in real time, face to face, which is why we incentivize that. So that's a great question. I didn't think to bring those language capabilities, but I will send that to you.
Okay, and also you mentioned several times about the task force, the safety task force, and ongoing conversations with different community groups. Are there focused efforts to reach out to Asian American communities, or are there representatives serving on those task forces?
Yeah, it was. Thank you for asking. That was actually a very representative task force, with including representatives appointed by council from the Asian American community. The task force has been, it is wrapped up its work. And so much of the community outreach that's recommended in the task force's report has been handed off to our Community Policing Advisory Committee, and they are undertaking the steps of reaching out to our community and providing community forum opportunities. That just did one this past weekend with members of the Hispanic community. So what I would say is, as I said in my opening remarks, we and they will come anytime, no matter how hard we try to get out and catch every group. Undoubtedly, we will miss people. So what we would say is, please invite us. Even if you can give us 5 minutes on a standing agenda, we will welcome the opportunity to be there. And I know the same would be true for members of our advisory committee. They would agree with that and would try to attend.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so while we are preparing for this meetings, we have heard a lot of comments from our small business owners. Let me see if we have members from well, there is this, yes, Mr. Steve New is serving on the board of CAFA organization. It's a small business organization that is serving lots of restaurant owners and the small business owners in our community. And I know that he's the one that heard the most from them. So would you like to make your comments, Steve? Hello, Steve. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you, Wenbing, for inviting me to this meeting. Thank our Chief Chris to have a nice presentation.
Thank you.
And I am represent small business, Chinese community, small business in particular. I have over 1,000 Chinese restaurants, my client, and I've been walk to those business pretty often. And I hear so many stories happen to our communities. You know, people, our business people has been bothered, insulted, hurt, killed in the last 20 years. It's just too many stories to share. So I think, you know, the law enforcement community needed to constantly have communication with the Asian Chinese communities. The story we have, you know, some of the Chinese restaurant owner has been a target for those people who try to commit crimes for a couple of reasons. Number one, most people does not speak good English, right. So this is an easy target for them. Number two, our most Chinese people engage in restaurant business. Restaurant is a cash-intensive business, so a lot of cash involved in this business. So these criminals target our people who has the cash. So this is one of the major reasons our community has been hurt, has been targeted for crime very dramatically. So for those reasons that I think that we needed to our voice need to be heard by our law enforcement communities. And, we needed to take some steps to Chapel Hill in particular is a very relatively safe place. Some of the small rural areas, Durham, for example, we have incident all the time. So once the incident occurred, some people just not even call the police because they're scared. I have a restaurant, in Durham. Before they closed down the business, 3 people hold a shotgun back forth to make sure nobody chased them, and then they can drive the van over to the back door and have 2 guys hold a pistol, and the rest people can load into the truck and load into the van. The situation like this it just go crazy. I mean, it's just people just scared to do any business. So this is going to affect our taxpayer job, tax incomes and the local city revenues drop, a number of employments. So we needed to dramatically change this situation we are currently have. So I'm happy to have this meeting. This is a great meeting. Seriously, we have a Chief Blue has did a very wonderful presentation. My concern is that we needed to have more communication between the law enforcement community with the Asian communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, sir, and I appreciate them very much. And we always need to do a better job communicating. It's good for us to be reminded of that. Your comments answered the question, or at least your comments echo what I was going to say. What we know, particularly the last few years, a number of Asian American restaurateurs have been specifically targeted, as you know. Many of them in Durham, I'm knocking on wood, not so much in Chapel Hill, although some restaurant owners who live in Chapel Hill and do business in Durham have been victimized too. And I think you're absolutely right for the reasons you say. Sometimes there's a language barrier, sometimes there's a concern about reporting to law enforcement because of maybe no relationship there. Oftentimes cash business, all the reasons that you said. I can't speak, we work closely with the Durham Police Department. I can't make any promises on their behalf, but what I will say about us and what I would encourage folks who are doing business in Durham and other communities to do is to reach out. For us, every business situation is slightly different. What we will do, however, is come out to your business and talk with you about your individual security needs, make recommendations, share with you what our response might look like in case you need us, answer questions that you have. We try to make recommendations that are not expensive to implement if they have a cost at all. Sometimes they're simply procedural. Other times they are intended to let you know of services we offer that you may not have known about. For example, if you've got a big bank deposit you need to make, instead of putting that in your car and taking it to your house to take to the bank the next day, which is exactly where some of those robberies over the last couple of years have happened, we'll escort you to the bank and let you make a night deposit. All you got to do is call us and ask us to do that. You have to wait a few minutes until someone's available, but we will come and help you do that. And that's just one example of several where I think it's worthwhile for us to come in and speak with you individually at your businesses, see what your needs are. Something else that is increasingly important in our investigations is the use of video evidence. And so many business owners install security systems to include video capability that either don't know how to work or it's not maintained well, or it's not in a time of crisis they're not able to access it. That's the kind of thing that we'd like to come in and talk with you about because increasingly cases are solved through the use of video. So I say all of that to say I appreciate you raising that issue and reminding me that we need to do better on our communication. That's always the case. But what I would do is take advantage of this forum and say, please reach out to me if you would like us to come out and meet with you and your business and your staff and do some individual consultation there. Again, that's free of charge. You already pay for it in your taxes, and we would welcome the opportunity to do that.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe in the future we can arrange those meetings with our
Yeah.
police department and the small businesses, just specifically to discuss those issues.
That'd be great.
I think that's great. And then I think that the question I see in the chat room, I think is related to the question that Steve just mentioned, because I heard from some of the small business owners, some is just homeowners, because they feel unsafe, so they prepare to buy guns as a way to self-protection. So here's the question in the chat room, is that for residents who legally own guns, what are the main issues that should be paid attention to in the storage and the use of guns? Is it illegal to hold and use a personal taser for the purpose of self-defense in the public area? So it's of course, it's a very, it's a sad question, but on the other hand, you can sense the helplessness when the people asking that kind of questions, because they really feel unsafe living in our community, doing their businesses. So for that kind of questions, I don't know if you have comments or answers.
I do, and I'm really glad to hear that question. So I think that to the part about legality, I think that's maybe the easiest one, the quickest one to answer. The question in the chat is it legal to hold and use a personal taser for the purpose of self-defense in the public area? I think any weapon that you have acquired legally and are carrying legally, in other words, not carrying in a place where it's prohibited, and you follow the laws of self-defense, then you're fine to do that. That in and of itself, that conversation and that question is probably an hour-long meeting by itself. So I think the easiest answer is to say if you bought it legally and you're carrying it legally, which if you don't know if you are or not, then your responsibility as the person carrying it is to come educated on what is legal and what is not. And depending on how you carry it, a requirement of you being licensed to do so is that you've gone through some training around carrying it, particularly if you're carrying it concealed. I'm glad to answer specific questions, and folks, please email me those. But I would just say, if you're carrying legally and you need to use it to defend yourself, you're probably in pretty good shape, generally speaking. I would rather say more to your question about what are the safety concerns. And I have two very important ones that I always like to emphasize. One, safe storage. In our community, as I mentioned before, we don't have a lot of violent crime, which means we don't have a lot of gun-related crime. And we should all be very thankful for that. What we do have, though, unfortunately, is unbelievably irresponsible storage of weapons, including in our community. It would blow your mind for me to tell you how many guns are stolen out of unlocked cars in our community every month. And that's another data point I didn't think to bring, but it is staggering. Someone buys a gun, they put it under the seat of their car, and they leave the car in their driveway unlocked. Or worse yet, they leave it in their unlocked glove compartment at their apartment complex. And then they're surprised when it's taken. There are a number of concerns with that. One, of course, your weapon is out there now. It's registered to you, and if it's used in commission of a crime and then recovered, it's going to come back to you. And you'll find yourself having to try to explain how your weapon was used in a crime. Maybe more importantly, and of more concern is it could be used to hurt somebody else. And depending on how you stored it or didn't store it securely, you might actually find yourself criminally or civilly liable for someone else's injury. So both. Never mind the moral concerns with having your weapon taken because of irresponsible storage and used to harm someone else. And I think that's such an important point to make. I don't mean to lecture, but I'll just say the number of times it happens in our community is disturbing. And so if you have it, you have a responsibility to store it responsibly. And that goes along with my second point, which is if you have it, you have a responsibility to learn to use it with proficiency, particularly if you choose to have a gun. Now, I will tell you, despite the fact that I carry one every day as part of my job, I'm not a big gun person. I don't have guns in my personal home other than my work-related ones. I don't have any moral opposition. That's just my personal choice. That said, the ones that I have, I'm proficient with them, and I'm confident that if I have to use them, I can do that well. Sadly, most gun owners cannot say that. And my concern for anyone who gets one because they're concerned for their safety, which is certainly legitimate, is that if you don't know how to use it, it actually can end up being used against you. And then you're certainly less safe than you were before that gun was introduced into the encounter. So what I would say, and I'll wrap up my lecture on the subject with simply saying, if you choose to purchase a weapon for protection in your home or your business, you really owe it to yourself, your loved ones, your neighbors, customers, to know how to work it, to be proficient in its use, to be proficient in how you maintain it, make sure it's operating appropriately. And that requires practice, and that requires some education and some learning. And I believe everyone on this call would understand that responsibility, but sadly, many gun owners do not. And that's where tragedies occur. So in summary on that question, if you're carrying it legally and you have to use it for self-defense, hopefully you're okay. Storage is vitally important. Safe storage to keep everyone safe is vitally important. And actually being proficient with the weapon, if you choose to have it, is also vitally important. And again, those questions, we could spend hours on those questions, but I think those are my important tips.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. I think that the gun ownership issue is, of course, it's a controversial issue to say the least. But I think, like you said, if you choose to be a gun owner, then you need to be a responsible gun owner. And you said if you do not know how to use it properly, then it will be used against you. I think that is a very to the point. So I think that we can, in the future, if we, because that is an issue that I have heard from people over and over again about their thinking of buying a gun, or is trying to make the decision of trying to decide whether or not that's safe to do so. And I certainly do not think that I'm equipped to answer those kind of questions. So I think that we can help to make the connections with the police. Sure. Maybe that you have some organizations to recommend, or maybe the police can organize some kind of like safe gun ownership training or information session. I think it will be very helpful, because if we do not do that properly, there will be a tragedy. I think that I can just see that happen. Okay.
Very important question. I'll work on compiling some information to share with you. And again, glad to come back anytime. So maybe we want to do this again, in a few weeks or a few months.
Okay, great. So the last question, I think it's related the mental health issue that you mentioned. As we have seen, it's a pattern all around the country, and I think that even among this local Asian American community, we have heard several incidences that related to mental health issues, and some is in the acute crisis. So I think for those issues, I think it's very important for people to understand what kind of resources are. And I think for the last question, I think Stanley, I don't know if Stanley, you want to ask the question yourself, or you want me to paraphrase it? Okay, then I will paraphrase it. I think he's asking that for people who are in that emergency situation that involves mental health crisis, what kind of response that can they call the police for those kind of issues, and how can they be assured that when they call the police, the situation is not going to be elevated to a point to be actually less safe? So I think there are concerns, and I have heard tragedies among the Asian American and Chinese American community, that some tragedies that happened when the person with mental health issues, and then when they call the police, actually they're being shot by the police. So I think those kind of issues, people are very much concerned. If you can shed any light on that, that would be very helpful.
Sure, and I'll just kind of build on my comments earlier about our crisis unit and our need for continued community investment. So first, to our response. Listen, I'm very, very proud of our officers and have a lot of confidence in them. They are not mental health professionals. That's not what they're hired to do. And quite honestly, they're not trained to be mental health professionals, no matter how good I think they are. And they get much more training than the state of North Carolina requires them to get. They're not mental health professionals. Where we complement that fact and perhaps make up for it a little bit in our community is the existence of that crisis unit I talked about before. who are, again, master's level clinicians with real clinical and case management experience, who are often responding to us, the folks who are experiencing mental health crisis. That gives us a response capability that's very different than most communities. But I will tell you that's not enough either. I mean, what we know is our mental health support systems in our community and in our state and nationally have been torn down over the years. And so we're going to do the very best we can. We're going to continue, at least at our local level, in investing in those kind of immediate crisis response capabilities. Those are not long-term case management capabilities. My crisis team's not able to provide ongoing care for folks who need ongoing care. And those are the things that kind of upstream were discussed by our community safety task force. So I won't say a lot more about the police response, except to say that I have a lot of confidence that my folks recognize that sometimes their presence actually makes the situation worse. And the ability to bring one of our trained social workers in with or instead of an officer and get an officer out to de-escalate is normal business for us. And we've seen too many tragedies across the country when communities did not have that resource. I don't think that we're immune from something going bad. So please don't misunderstand it. But what I do think is we, as a police department, we're better equipped than most. That does not mean that the community need is not significant, because it is significant. And if your backstop for mental health response in your community is law enforcement, then you really, really are lacking the resources you need. And sadly, in too many communities, that's the case. The last point I'll make about that is we also need greater interim response capabilities in our community, just like most communities. If we do respond and you're experiencing a mental health crisis, our options are pretty limited. If you have some kind of ongoing treatment program that we can drive you to, fantastic. Otherwise, it's the jail or the emergency room. Those are the choices we have. Most of the time, neither of those are actually the right and best choice, but it just happens to be what most communities have in this day and age. So I will tell you, we will continue to commit to all the training officers can get on appropriate mental health response. I promise you that. But the reality of it is there's not enough out there.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the CAFA, our community, as well as some volunteers within CAFA, actually has been taking action. There is a mental health first aid group is doing that, and Stanley, who raised this question in the chat room, he also has a mental health support group under CAFA. I know that people are working, putting their efforts in reaching out, trying to address that mental health crisis issues that we're facing. So thank you very much. I think we just need to work together on those issues.
Yes, yeah.
Next, I know that it's 9:02, but I have this question from James Shen. He is a high schooler from East Chapel Hill High School. So I really would like to encourage that. So why don't we bring James? Hi, James. Can you unmute yourself and turn on your camera?
Hello, I'd like to thank Mr. Wu for his work on the town safety. I would like to ask a couple questions. First, are there any plans with the police department for like increased school security in case of incidents? And if such an incident were to occur, would you have any tips for how students and staff could stay safe?
Great question. So I think the best way to answer that question is, I don't know if you're on for the whole call or not, you might have heard my comments about the school resource officer program and the important community conversation around that. Our community is looking hard at what's the appropriate role of police officers in the school environment. And our school system has been studying that for a couple of years now. And I'm not really sure what the right answer to that question is myself, actually. And I've had kids in these schools, came up in these schools myself, and now I have officers who work for me who are stationed in the school, and it's a complicated thing to work through. To your specific question about additional police when warranted, well, James, are you at East Chapel Hill?
Yes.
Okay, so you're aware of some ongoing fights that have been happening there,
Yes.
including a big one today.
Yeah.
And so, when we have incidents that flare up, we work closely with school administrators and with the Lincoln Center on having some additional response capability if needed. What we don't want to do is have 100 cops there. That's not the right message to send, and it's probably much more than is necessary. On the other hand, I want to provide you the reassurance that we're aware that when tensions are elevated, an enhanced capability to respond is important. And so for the next few days, we'll be working closely with school officials at East to be sure that we are close by and able to respond if needed. It is a complicated conversation because the discussion around officers in schools is a good one. And concerns around the appropriateness of officers in schools and how they're used is an important discussion. And our schools being safe for everyone is also very important. So I'll certainly elaborate on anything that you'd like me to say more about.
Okay, thank you very much for your input.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, James, for logging on to this forum. Every time that we have young people to join in and willing to take action and be part of the community conversation, I always feel like we have to do something to encourage that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now is 9:05, and so it feels like it's a very short period of time. There's still many questions I'm sure that people have in their mind, and we still have some questions in our chat room, and we're going to compile them and bring them to Chief Blue. And I'm hoping that this only serves as the beginning and not the end of our conversation. And we are going to have more focused, detailed conversations on specific issues. So with that, is there a final comments that anyone feel like they have to use this last few minutes to make their comments? Or otherwise, I would just ask Mr. Buonzi to wrap this up. Okay, Alan.
Thank you. And Chief Blue, want to thank you for giving us an incredible information and breadth. And clearly your thoughtful approach is at play, is at work when it comes to community safety. So I thank you for your efforts, for the efforts of our law enforcement officers as well, to be responsive in these times to our community's needs. So I thank you for all that you're doing. I'll just close out with a couple of thoughts of my own in the context of what I think the state can do to support our efforts to make sure that our community is safe. Chief Blue referenced earlier the hate crimes legislation that did not pass in the spring session of last year. I had the good fortune of being invited by Representative Verla Insco as well as Representative Marsha Morey during the last General Assembly legislative session to work with them on the Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And as Chief Blue said, didn't get out of committee, unfortunately, but I know we had put in a lot of comprehensive changes to the Hate Crimes Act, including a requirement that law enforcement agencies, requirement that a hate crimes database be created and that training be offered to not only law enforcement agencies, but also to district attorneys so that they know how to identify hate crimes that are perpetrated on folks. Chief Blue hit it on the nail. In the past year, we've seen, I think, over 300% increase in hate crimes against the Asian American community. That is a situation that we need to rectify quick, fast, and in a hurry. And I firmly believe one of the ways that we can address it is by authorizing our General Assembly to create this hate crimes database so that law enforcement can better track the crimes that are perpetrated against our Asian American community. And also so that folks are better educated, not just the district attorneys or law enforcement, but even the general public is better educated about how to identify hate crimes that are going on and have people act to prevent and mitigate that kind of hatred against folks. It's an issue that is somewhat personal to me because my father, he is an immigrant. He is from Ghana, a West African country. And I can remember one of the things that marked his experience very early on in the States was hate, was people saying offensive things to him because of where he was from and making assumptions about him because of where he was from. Thankfully, he did not experience violence, but a lot of people aren't so fortunate. And so we need to be responsive to that. And that is certainly something that I would be committed to if I'm elected. More than that, I'll just say, as Hongbin said earlier, this is the beginning of a conversation. And I so appreciate Chief Blue being willing to reach into communities to talk with folks about the issues that they're confronting, the challenges that they're facing, and to really be in partnership with folks. And so I would just encourage, continuing on in that spirit of collaboration, to continue on in the spirit of working together to make sure that we are all feeling safe and supported in our community. And if I have the good fortune of serving the State House, please count me in as an advocate, as someone who is here for you, as someone you can reach out to at any point to talk about challenges and issues that you are seeing so that I can be responsive and do the best I can to address them. I will put my email and my website in the chat box here in case you have any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alan. We are very fortunate to have both of you serving our community. And I think that the people living in Chapel Hill, we always feel that we're very fortunate that we have people who are really dedicated to public service, who have good heart and really trying to bring out the voices for the people who are voiceless. And I think for the Asian American communities, we certainly feel like this is a very timely topic for us to engage this conversation, especially given that we have just experienced the pandemic and other challenges that we can anticipating, including the geopolitical conflicts that are coming and the economic challenges that I think that's very likely that is going to be several years down the line. So I think all of these issues, I think they are all very challenging, and there are lots of times that we almost feel like helpless at this time. But I think it's good that by coming to meetings like this, we'll see that many people like Alan, like Chief Blue are working tirelessly trying to address those issues to make sure that everyone is safe, that we are not only survive in our community, that there's opportunities for everyone to thrive. So thank you very much. And I would like to thank you everyone for coming and bring your questions in the discussion. If you have additional questions or follow-up issues that you would like us to bring forward to our police and to our local and the state legislators, feel free to get in touch with us, get in touch with CAFA. So I would like to thank CAFA for the great things that you have been doing in the community. So thank you very much, everyone. And with that, thank you and wishing you a good evening.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, then.